Today we have the opportunity to set Oregon on the path for a new and prosperous future. This budget deficit represents an opportunity to fundamentally change and improve the way the state does business. The balanced budget that I am delivering to you today breaks decisively from the past and also confronts the difficult spending and budget choices that we've been able to avoid or mask by the use of one-time revenue. This budget will require significant cuts in public services that are very, very important to Oregonians, including things like education and health care. But I believe that if we do this right, and if we do it together, we can use this moment to lay the foundation for a more sustainable and prosperous future for our state. This budget includes ideas that have been advocated by Republicans and ideas that have been advocated by Democrats, because Oregon's success in the next 5 months depends on our willingness to build new teams, new coalitions, new partnerships that move us beyond the divisive partisanship of the past. None of us should underestimate the magnitude of the fiscal challenge that we are facing here, but we should never for a moment question our ability to meet that challenge. If we make smart choices now, if we do this together over the next few months, we can put Oregon on a new path, one that steadily makes our economy stronger, our people healthier, and our children better educated. The fact is that we have the tools to meet this challenge. We don't need to spend more today to begin to invest in the future. But one thing should be absolutely clear to each and every one of us. It will be impossible for us to continue to provide, the important public services that Oregonians need and deserve by continuing to do things the way we've been doing them. The only path forward is to break fundamentally from the past and to redesign the way we provide public services in the state of Oregon. This budget is built on a very conservative foundation. I ask each state agency to take the general fund and lottery fund revenue that they know they're going to have as the starting point. We expect about $1.2 billion in additional revenue growth in this biennium, and I've taken that and reallocated it based on a set of priorities, 5 in particular: putting Oregonians back to work, creating an efficient, effective program for early childhood success, creating a 0 through 20 education investment strategy, and reducing costs in health care and in public safety. Now, if we do this right, we actually can realign our state revenue with our state resources going forward and eliminate the projected decade of deficits. And that's a key element and objective in this budget framework. Let's start with the issue of economic development and getting Oregonians back to work. This budget funds a number of proven job creation strategies to get people back to work in the short term and invests in the success of early childhood to achieve, as a foundational element, to achieve Oregon's long-term educational and economic objectives. We're moving forward with some early actions for short-term job creation, developing flexible financing operations to retrofit our schools for energy efficiency, aiding market access to our emerging biomass industry, and stepping up our workforce development efforts and reconnecting out-of-work Oregonians with high-demand jobs. I've also included funding for the Oregon Innovation Council. In addition, some line items for limited tax credits targeted at economic development. One is to boost the film and video tax credit. As some of you may know, the governor of New Mexico has eliminated their credit, and there are quite a few movie operators and directors looking for a place to land, and we thought we might have them come here. We've also included a smaller, much more focused business energy tax credit that's specifically designed for community-scale energy efficiency projects, and I've included a $25 million capital gains rollover for reinvesting resources in Oregon job-producing companies. The second step is that we need to streamline and build an accountable system of early family and childhood investment. If our central challenge here is rebuilding the House of Oregon, then successfully investing in the developmental needs of children is the foundation on which that house will be built. In Oregon each year, 45,000 kids are born, and 45% of those children are exposed to one or more socioeconomic risk factors that hampers their ability to take advantage of the educational experience when they get to school. These are well-recognized risk factors. They include poverty, negative peer associations, unstable family environments, substance abuse, involvement in the criminal justice system. Overcoming those risk factors on the front end is key to reducing and having to pay for the problems we know will develop downstream in terms of social dependency, in terms of involvement in the criminal justice system. Today in Oregon, each year we spend $380 million on programs for children between 0 and 5 years old. And this doesn't include what we spend in K through 12 education or in health care or in other parts of the human resource budget. We have over half a dozen state agencies that administer dozens of different programs focused at early childhood health and education. These programs are not aligned. They are not coordinated. In many cases, you can't track a child through those programs. There's no clear accountability lines. They're not directly connected to the K through 12 system, and they tend to focus on service delivery rather than outcomes for children. We need a better return on investment for that $380 million, and in fact, we've added resources to that because it's so important, so foundational for everything else we do in the state of Oregon, but we have to change the way those services are delivered. This approach, and you can find the full new delivery model on our website, unifies these disparate programs, streamlines administrative costs, it measures outcomes, and it ensures that every child in our state will be ready to learn when they get to school. If you look at the budget, all of those resources from the disparate programs are concentrated and captured in what's called the Early Learning Council. Now, I want to make it clear that the way these dollars are currently being spent will not change in the first year of the biennium, but we will then be developing this new delivery model for use in the second year of the biennium. The Early Learning Council is the first element of the 0 through 20 education investment budget that I'll describe in just a moment. These changes are significant, and many of them will be very difficult to accomplish. But I know that with appropriate investment, with a successful new service delivery model, and with clear accountability for well-defined outcomes, that we can expect in the near future that all our children are ready to learn when they get to school and that they can actually read when they leave the first grade. And that is a key indicator for future success in education and in the workforce. And that investment, this is one of the few parts of the budget where I've actually increased investments. That investment will be returned many times over through productive, responsible citizens who are in our workforce, not in our prisons or in our social support system, and by reduced costs of the social safety net and public safety services in the future. The next element is to develop a single, transparent, 0 through 20 education investment strategy. Our current educational funding model, as you know, is very inefficient. It's fragmented. The higher ed budget is developed in a silo, separate from the K through 12 budget and the community college budget, and early childhood programs are not clearly connected to this system. We need a new approach to the delivery of public education in the state of Oregon that gives us better outcomes for our children, more resources for our teachers, and better value for the taxpayer. The Early Learning Council, as I said, is the first step in developing a single, transparent education investment budget that is integrated, that is efficient, and that is accountable to the taxpayers for the outcomes that we expect. In the K through 12 system, this budget allocates $5.56 billion for the biennium, but we've front-end loaded this by putting about 52% of those resources in the first year. That gives us close to a $5.8 billion funding level in the first year and actually represents a slight increase in funding over the current school year. In order to maintain this level of funding in the classroom for the second year of the biennium, however, we're going to have to make some significant changes and find efficiencies and cost savings through looking at things that in the past have been controversial. The consolidation of school districts, looking at how we can find efficiencies in school transportation. I've recommended that the resources from our ESDs flow directly to school districts and allowing the school districts to buy back the services that they need. Now, we will work with the advocates to figure out the best way to achieve this, but one thing needs to be very, very clear. We cannot continue to do business as usual. We cannot provide adequate, stable resources for our public school system by continuing to operate in the way we've operated in the past. I've introduced legislation to create an Oregon Education Investment Fund, a 0 through 20 unified budget, and an Oregon Education Investment Board that will oversee it. In anticipation of the passage of that legislation, next week I will sign an executive order that creates the Oregon Education Investment Team that will oversee the redesign work for the early childhood investment piece of this agenda, as well as the cost efficiency and cost-saving measures that we will have to find for the second year of the biennium for K through 12. It's also very important that even in this difficult budget climate, we minimize the usual practices of simply shortening the school year and laying off teachers. And that means that we are going to have to somehow come to terms with the disconnect that was created by Ballot Measure 5 between the resources the state has available and 197 local bargaining units that signed contracts that may or may not reflect the actual fiscal health of the state. And we'll talk more about that next week when I issue my executive order. This budget also recommends that the patrol function of the Oregon State Police be moved from the general fund back onto the highway fund where it was in the early 80s. This will require a ballot measure in November. There are two reasons for this. An education reason. This frees up $93 million that we can reinvest in our educational system, and I have that targeted for the K through 12 system. Also, the per person, per capita state police presence has continued to dwindle over the last 30 years. And in many rural counties, the Oregon State Police provide the primary source of law enforcement. This budget also, in the post-secondary area, focuses largely on undergraduate education and on access. We have added $20 million to the Opportunity Grant Program. We've got $6 million in support for our regional institutions and $2 million for challenge grants to try to encourage regional collaboration. So, for example, better collaboration between Eastern Oregon and Treasure Valley Community College and Blue Mountain Community College. Now, those two areas in the budget, early childhood investment and 0 through 20 education, constitute investments in Oregon's future. These are investments that will give people a pathway into the workforce, a pathway to a family-wage job, economic security, and lift up the whole state. The second element here, the second challenge then, is to reduce expenditures in two key areas. One is health care, and the other one is in public safety. The Oregon Health Authority and the long-term care services took the biggest hit in this budget because of the heavy reliance on one-time revenue. In the case of health care, we had about $780 million of stimulus money. We had provider tax money. We had tobacco tax money. So they face about a 40% cut, all things being equal. Now, we put some resources back into that budget. But I'm committed to not doing in Oregon what we did in many other states, which is simply balance the budget by throwing people under the bus, dropping coverage and forcing them to get their primary care through the emergency department. Instead, we want to use this deficit, this budget deficit, to lay the groundwork for a fundamental change in the way our health care is delivered in the second year of the biennium for people on the Oregon Health Plan and people who receive dual long-term care services through the state of Oregon. Our healthcare system, even more than our educational system, is fragmented, it is inefficient, it is expensive, and it produces very, very poor results in terms of population health. So our objective is to share some sacrifice on the front end, to hold hands and recognize that we are going to require some significant reduction in provider reimbursement rates initially, as well as some reduction in benefits, and then design a new delivery model for implementation in the second year of the biennium. And the team that's doing that design work will meet for the first time tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. This will require some significant waivers from the federal government, and I've been in contact with Dr. Don Berwick, who heads the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid under the Department of Health and Human Services, and we believe that we have an opportunity to get some significant federal waivers and flexibility, not only to address the short-term challenge of this budget, but to build a new healthcare delivery system in the state of Oregon. The final area is public safety. We have very, very little flexibility in our adult correctional system because of ballot measure 11, because of the requirement of pre-release hearings, and the constraints of the supermajority requirements for making any changes. So we have spent about $250 million back into the adult correctional system to ensure that there's enough money in our community correctional system so counties don't opt out, and also to maintain our existing prison capacity on the adult side. On the Oregon Youth Authority, we have more flexibility. We made a significant reduction in closed custody beds, about 425. I expect some of those are going to have to be put back, and moved resources into the community corrections program for juveniles. The point I think we should take away from the public safety budget is that this is a black hole that is going to continue to pull resources out of investments in children and out of our educational system, in short, out of those very programs and services that keep people in the workforce and out of prison in the first place. So even as we are committed to spending significant resources on our correctional system in the next 2 years, it's incumbent upon us to do two things before the legislative session in 2012. Examine, understand, and try to reduce the per capita cost of incarceration in the Oregon correctional system. And secondly, pursue vigorously the task force recommended by Governor Kulongoski to look at Oregon's sentencing guidelines and policies to see if we can find a more rational way to use those public safety resources in the future. Let me just conclude by pointing out that this budget is the first step in an 8 to 10-year reinvestment strategy for the state of Oregon. It will, in fact, realign our state expenditures with our state revenues and put us on a solid, stable foundation going forward. It will, over time, increase our ability to invest in early childhood success and in 0 through 20 education, which in turn, over time, will increase the number of people in the workforce, increase revenues coming into the state, and reduce the cost of public safety and reduce the cost of social programs. Let me leave you with two things. First, again, we should not underestimate the magnitude of the difficulty of the challenge we have before us. But we should never question our ability to get it done. If we do it together, if we do it right, we will emerge from this session on July 1st with a balanced budget, a unified state, and a much, much brighter picture going forward. I have shared this information with the legislative leadership 2 weeks ago at Mahonia Hall. We gathered with the co-chairs of Ways and Means from both sides, the two speakers and the Senate President. They understand the content of this budget, and I'm calling on them to develop a co-chair's budget as soon as possible, and particularly to do something that we've never done in the state of Oregon, balance the budget to the February 14th revenue forecast. The general tendency is to wait until May to make all the difficult choices, and trust me, they're not going to get any easier by waiting a couple of months. We need to balance this budget to the February 15th revenue forecast and then be prepared with a plan to reallocate any additional resources that might show up in the May forecast. There's no reason not to do it, and this should be the session that we actually pull that off. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
With the higher education budget, is it built around the notion of the reforms that the university system is pursuing?
The question has to do with the university system reforms. The budget has not actually been built around that. That's a separate suite of bills. There's several different approaches to it. I do support providing additional operational flexibility to our post-secondary institutions to give them the ability to manage their finances. That's not directly reflected in the budget, and I do recognize that there's a proposal by the University of Oregon. You wouldn't be from Eugene, would you? That would use the portion of the state's resources dedicated that would go to U of O to bond. That's not a part of the budget. But that doesn't mean that, let me add, that that's not a legitimate idea that needs to be discussed, but I wanted to balance the budget base with resources we have.
On your state employee package, as I understand it, so you're asking for 3% per year in an increase. Why did you settle on that number, and what kind of cost is that?
Well, we haven't actually settled on a number. We clearly are going to have some very, very difficult collective bargaining over the 6% pickup of the police employer contributions to PERS, the whole issue of employee contribution to health care, and obviously over COLAs and step increases. We're approaching this from the standpoint of total compensation. We do expect to have some increase in total compensation for our public employees, but it will not be the rate that's projected under the current scenario.
How much, though, have you put in the budget for that? Have you put a certain number in the budget that you're anticipating at this point?
We have not broken that out, and I'm going to wait until we'll put an economic offer on the table by February 22nd, and that would be the appropriate time to discuss the actual details of our collective bargaining approach.
Governor, does your proposal include increases to the tobacco tax or the gas tax?
No, there's no. There are some fee increases in this budget. There are no tax increases. I will add that we will be preparing a supplemental recommendation that will put several $1 million back into our natural resource agencies to reduce the anticipated fees in agriculture and to adequately fund the Oregon Forest Practices Act. But there are no tax increases in the budget.
What about retention of the kicker?
That's not in the budget, but I do support and have long supported a referral to use both the corporate and personal kicker to first capitalize a very healthy savings account for the state of Oregon before it kicks back to the taxpayers. I believe there are several bills that have been introduced to address that issue.
Schools are arguing that their share of the budget is in decline for many years, not just the numbers, but the actual percent of the budget that goes to schools, and they want it to at least even out. Have you given that some thought? I know you.
Well, there's a couple of things we need to recognize here. That the percentage of the state general fund that goes to education is less important than the outcomes we're getting for the dollars in that percentage, regardless of what it is. So let's not confuse a percentage with getting kids ready for the workforce. I'm not saying there isn't a relationship between adequately funding our schools and good educational outcomes. But I think we need to start by redesigning the way we provide education, make our budgetary process more transparent, more accountable, focus less on enrollment-based funding for institutions and more on outcomes-based funding for students. We have to also recognize that the reason the percentage is declining is largely due to increased costs in public safety and particularly in healthcare. Healthcare is the fastest growing cost in the human resource budget. Here's the public safety budget over here. Here's DHS with Human Services. This has been expanding, and that's eating up the ability to invest in education. It's true in every state that the cost of Medicaid program in some budgets exceeds the cost of public education. So it is imperative in this budget that we begin to shift our pattern of investments, and that's why the increase in spending and reorganization of services to early children is so fundamental to meet our educational and economic objectives. Now, let me just say finally that we believe the level of resource that we have in the K-12 budget can form a stable funding floor going forward. It's clearly not adequate under our current definition. But if you ask any school district, they will tell you that while the amount of money they get is important, it is equally important to know how much they're going to get from month to month and from year to year so that you can plan and budget to that amount.
How far into the future would you delay the starting date for Measure 57? And in your longer-term plan beyond this upcoming biennium, would you seek to eliminate the need for a new prison construction altogether in that 10-year period?
Well, I do think that it's important to try to manage our prison system without having to build additional prison capacity. And you do that in two ways. You do it by thoughtfully reevaluating sentencing guidelines and policies, which will be a topic, hopefully, of the 2012 legislative session. Although this budget is predicated, as you indicated, on deferring 57 for another 2 years. It's predicated on a second look for kids under Measure 11. It's predicated on making some tweaks in the DUI portion of the ballot measure that just passed. But that's one part of it. The real gold, if you will, the real payoff is to make the investments on the front end to keep people in school, in the workforce, and out of prison in the first place. And, you know, Oregon and most states are really caught in this downward spiral where you have to spend more and more on health care and more on public safety, and that comes out of investments in kids and education, which then drives more people into those programs in the back end.
If there's a turnaround in the economy and let's say the February forecast or even the later one shows that you have more than that $1.2 billion to spend, would you try to put that money into a savings account, or would you continue to beef up some of the programs that you feel are inadequately funded already?
Well, I would certainly like to put some of that into the ending balance to give us a larger cushion. I would be willing to support reallocating some of those resources, but with a big condition, that they're not being spent simply to continue our current service delivery model, that there's resources that are actually being spent to move us to a new system. For example, if additional resources are raised or become available for our healthcare budget, I wouldn't support using those to simply prop up the existing delivery model, which is nothing more than kicking the can down the road. If we use those resources to make a smoother transition to a new delivery model, that would be something I would support.
In terms of your economic measures that you outlined in the first part of your remarks, how do you measure whether those proposals actually create jobs?
Well, on some of them, we can actually be quite accurate. The program that we funded in here with, I think, $3.4 million, which is essentially merges our Oregon National Career Readiness Certificate Program with our on-the-job training program, is anticipated to create over 1,300 jobs over the next year by essentially connecting out-of-work Oregonians with high-demand jobs. The Oregon Investment Council created about 600 jobs in the last biennium. We expect it to do at least that well or better. So there are some quantifiable things. I can't quantify for you the impact of the capital gains tax referral or the film and video credit, but I do think that those clearly will have some immediate job creation.
What about on the weatherization? Do you have any sense of the job creation on that?
Well, we have, trying to think of the number per million. We're thinking probably next summer, several thousand jobs around Oregon, in direct jobs in terms of the actual weatherization. We're planning to use some of the 1149 public preference money, public service money from the utilities to bond to get some revenue for hitting those schools next summer. That'll ramp up once we pass the legislation that creates the energy efficiency revenue bond for later in the year. There'll also be some indirect jobs associated with that as well.
You put additional money into the K-12 stability. I think you put additional money, I believe, up to $300 million in the education stability fund. Is that with your intention to leave it there, or would that immediately come out if there's?
Yeah, we haven't touched those funds. Those resources are still there, and again, it's very important. I feel very strongly that those resources not be used to simply prop up the existing delivery model, but that they be used, if we use them, to make a transition to a more effective system.
Can you quickly discuss the impact on the state workforce of your budget? Is it going to be the same, or is it going to be significantly smaller, or what?
Well, I think there's basically three variables. You reduce benefits, you lay people off, or you cut the cost of actually providing services. And we're starting with trying to redesign the service delivery, but I think there obviously will be impacts on public employees, and I expect the workforce will be smaller rather than larger when we get through this exercise.
Thank you so much.